Today's episode of Socially Democratic is presented to you by Dunn Street. Dunn Street partners with businesses, organisations, unions and social democratic parties across the globe to train leaders, develop engagement strategies and empower people to organise for change. And Dunn Street will continue to work with folks that want to make a difference, inspire, give hope and enable leadership to achieve their shared purpose. To find out how you can partner with Dunn Street, hit us up at dunnstreet.com.au. Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 67 of Socially Democratic, your weekly centre-left political and cultural podcast that dives into the progressive issues of the day and the people leading them from home and abroad. On this week's episode, we are speaking with the Senator from New South Wales, Labor's Kristina Keneally. And Kristina talks about, in no particular order, Ohio, theological feminism, the NBA, Morrison Government subcontracting of leadership during a COVID crisis, climate policy, and right-wing nut jobs. So we've got a lot to cover in a very short period of time. So we really appreciate Senator Keneally coming on today's show to talk about all of those things. Don't forget that you can subscribe to Socially Democratic via your favourite podcast app. Follow us via all of the different social media platforms, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, on the Dunn Street socials. And let's get to today's episode. We're taping this one on a Wednesday morning in COVID-free Melbourne. And joining me on the line from Sydney is the former Premier of New South Wales, current Labor Senator for New South Wales, and more importantly, Notre Dame Academy back-to-back soccer MVP 1985 and 1986 to prove it was not a fluke the first time around. Senator Kristina Keneally, welcome to Socially Democratic.
Thank you. Thank you for hitting all the highlights of my sporting and professional career.
We're done then, aren't we, really? It's interesting, actually, that I read about that because you're certainly in the public sphere, you're known for your passion for basketball. And I'm just wondering, when did the transition from rising star in football change to basketball?
Well, in fact, one of the other accolades I achieved in high school was for 2 years in a row, 86 and 87. I was the most spirited player in basketball, which I think just goes to show that my skills were in one area and my enthusiasm was in another.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I love that.
But I grew up playing both sports. They were both very big girls' sports in the United States, and I come from a long line of really very good female basketball players in our family. So I love both those team sports.
So if you had a team in the NBA, who was your team?
Growing up in the States, in an hour south of Detroit, I love the Detroit Pistons, the Isaiah Thomas, Bill Laimbeer era. But when I got a bit older, really loved, of course, Michael Jordan and the Bulls, and had the real pleasure of living in Chicago during the three-peat era, and saw them play live. In fact, one point we lived up near where the Bulls practiced, and one point I was on my way to the grocery store and Michael Jordan in his MJ23 red Ferrari pulled out in front of me. It was a very exciting near brush with fame.
So you would have the Last Dance documentary on Netflix.
Loved The Last Dance. Loved it. I thought it was fantastic. My only frustration about it was, and I get why perhaps players and their families were not as keen, but I would have loved to have known more of what their families experienced during that period, because it was such an extraordinary shift in how basketball was understood in the U.S., how people were idolized, the celebrity, the fame, and I don't mean to pry into people's personal lives, but I do think that would have been a fascinating addition to have more of the Jordan children or more of the players' families kind of reflect on what that period was like for them as well. But I do understand why they might choose not to do that.
It was a fascinating documentary, and for me, I mean, 1988, I was in Year 7, and our basketball in Australia at that point on the schoolyard had just started to take off. And now when I think back on it, it must have been because of what was going on in the United States and Jordan, even though we couldn't get the games live on TV or any of that kind of stuff, for it to permeate into Australian school sport culture in a way by, say, 1992 or 3, so I'm now in year 12, I'm playing basketball, I'm representing my local town. The shoe culture in regional Victoria where I grew up was huge. Like as soon as the new Jordans came out, like everyone was down at the local sports store ready to buy, somehow convincing their parents to drop $200 on a pair of shoes. But it was, and just watching The Last Dance, it just took me back to realizing how powerful Michael Jordan was, not just as an athlete, but also as a product.
Absolutely. And I, Australian basketball, which I do know a fair bit about, having served as the CEO of Basketball Australia, you think back to that time and the NBL was huge. And I think partly the NBL was huge because people had a hunger to watch professional basketball. And when I first moved to Australia permanently in 1994, there wasn't the internet, there wasn't the ability to watch American sports on TV. There wasn't, I remember trying to follow the Final Four in the NCAA and just giving up because I was always a few days behind if I could try and get my hands on an American newspaper, et cetera. So I think there was a real hunger, and the NBL filled that void. And, people have complained ever since that the NBL has never been as popular. And I think part of that we have to acknowledge is because, you can lay on your couch on a Saturday afternoon and watch almost any basketball game that's being shown in America. You can watch here. And so the NBL is not competing with the NRL or AFL. They are competing with the NBA and the NCAA. And that's a big challenge. And I've got to applaud the NBL for the work that it's done in the past few years. We set them free from Basketball Australia and let them go and be really what they should be, which is an entertainment product, not a basketball development product for the Olympic team, but really an entertainment product. And I think they're doing well. They're finding their niche, but those heyday era crowds really reflected the fact that people couldn't watch Michael Jordan whenever they wanted or anyone else whenever they wanted, and now of course they can.
Yes, that's the other point as well. You're right. The NBL in the 1990s, I was a North Melbourne Giants fan. I was at the North Melbourne Giants Canberra Cannons final, I think, in 1989. Like it was huge at the old Glass House. It was just unbelievable, the crowds that were getting there. But it seems to be going through some sort of renaissance right now, though. I feel like basketball is coming back in Australia at a local level.
I think that's right. I think that the thing we had to, and during my time at BA, we came to grips with this, which is that the NBL used to be a high performance development program. Really, that the first Australian Olympic team was men's basketball team that was all from the NBL. The most recent ones have been lucky to have just a couple NBL players, and I imagine that. There will be a time when there are no NBL players on the Australian men's Olympic team. And that's because the high performance pathway program is really through the NCAA, through Europe, and through the NBA. And our best chance of winning a medal is to have as many of our players possible playing in the NBA. And so realizing that we didn't need to hang on to the NBL within Basketball Australia because it really wasn't a key part of our high performance program for men was, I think, a big step forward in letting the NBL go out and do the innovative types of things they needed to do to become a entertainment product like the NRL is, like the AFL is, rather than a high performance program for the men's Olympic team.
Anyway, I actually have like 3 or 4 follow-up questions. I'm going to stop here because it's going to turn into an NBA podcast.
We just turn this into a basketball podcast. I haven't even gotten into my favorite women's players or women's teams, but that's all right.
Like seriously, I could easily do that, but I know that I would immediately lose all my audience because they'll be going, Stephen, this is meant to be a politics podcast and not just to do your favorite.
I'll just say Lauren Jackson is the Michael Jordan of women's basketball and should always be acknowledged as such. And Australians should be incredibly proud of that. When I went to the NBA in New York, there, right in the lobby of the NBA, there were these giant frame photos of all their greats, and there was Lauren Jackson, and she's just awesome.
Do you think that she is not as appreciated then here in Australia as she's in the basketball community in the United States?
Look, I suspect every basketball player from Australia who makes it big in the US is probably more readily appreciated in the US, just given the scope of basketball in that country. And because, frankly, you know, whether you're Patty Mills or Lauren Jackson or any of the others who are currently playing in the NBA, you're playing most of your games overseas. You're not playing in front of Australian crowds, and you know, that's a challenge that we need to be, you know, raising the profile and finding ways to continually raise and connect the profile between our great players that go over and make a real impact in the US and their profiles here.
Okay, as I said, I promised I'd get back to politics questions. Now, you mentioned your father before, and can I sort of say on behalf of the Social Democratic listeners, can we pass on our condolences to both you and your family with the passing of your father? And we really appreciate you taking time to come on the show today. I know that probably the last couple of weeks have been incredibly hectic for you, so thank you very much for doing that. You tweeted.
Thank you.
You tweeted last week about your dad and mentioned that he was a lifelong Republican supporter from Ohio. And I just wondered, you growing up in Ohio, what moments led young Kristina on a pathway to democratic politics as opposed to the politics of your father?
Well, you know, my dad was a lifelong Republican, but he wasn't the type of person who rammed his political ideology down his children's throats. And in many ways, the type of Republican my dad was through most of my childhood and young adult years was not the type of Republicans we see today, sadly. That is, you know, both my parents raised their children with a strong sense of the importance of community, of making the world a better place and how you found it, of using your talents for good, of social justice. And, you know, yes, they believed in hard work and that hard work had its own rewards, but they also believed that if there was an injustice, that, you know, if you had the capacity to right that wrong, you should. And, you know, the Republicans I see today are very much almost want to deny that structural injustice exists. And so when you see them trying to do things like dismantle Obamacare, and you think, well, hang on, you know, there is a clear structural injustice in the United States that some people simply can't access healthcare because they're employed, they work in insecure work, because your health insurance is attached to your job in the US. So if you don't have a job, you don't have health insurance. Or if you work insecure work or part-time, you don't have health insurance. And so, yeah, I look at that and I think, you know, that is so contrary to the values I grew up with. And so I'm very grateful to my parents for that kind of strong sense of justice and community.
The commentary have written a lot in the United States recently about the sort of the political polarization that's occurring across the US and families' inability people from the different sides of politics and their inability to talk with each other. And it's funny, this weekend going into Thanksgiving, people won't be having arguments over the Rams-Bucks game, but they'll be actually at each other's throats over whether or not Joe Biden stole the election thanks to Hugo Chavez and a Venezuelan election company. When did we stop listening to each other, and when did facts become something that's up for negotiation?
Well, the easy answer is, you know, that the Trump presidency, with all its vitriol and division and, you know, ability to fan the flames of division and anger, made that all the more complicated and a feature, and hopefully not a permanent one, but definitely a feature of American politics. And, you know, what happens in America has ramifications for particularly the Western world and democratic countries around the world, because that those types of trends and fads take hold. That being said, I think back to the beginning of the Tea Party, back with Newt Gingrich and his contract with America, and the kind of claiming a victim mentality and a distrust of minorities and frustration at the changing face of the United States. And maybe it started back after the Civil War, when there wasn't a proper reconciliation with slavery. I mean, I suppose my point is, at one level, America has struggled with this throughout its history, but has more often than not found ways to put the unity of the Union, or the good of the Union, above all else. And so even with the Civil War, which was, incredibly divisive, bloody conflict, coming out of that was a determination to try to stitch the Union back together. And this is what really worries me as someone who has friends and family in the United States, and as someone who benefited greatly from growing up in that society, in that community, that the people seem to have lost the viewpoint that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, that the country, the Union, which every American learns when they go to school. You every day start at school with "I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the Union for which it stands, one nation under all, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all." And I don't know where that notion has gone, why that is no longer the motivating factor. It appears, and maybe it can come back. I hope it can come back. I believe that there are Republicans who, perhaps free of the Trump impact on their party, will grow a backbone and stand up for those values once again, because that has been the biggest dismay that I've had since Trump took over the Republican Party, is that the Republican Party of my youth, of George Herbert Walker Bush and Reagan and George W. Bush, where those people are, and those voices. And you hear them sometimes in John McCain and Mitt Romney, but I fear we don't hear them enough. We haven't heard them enough for the last 4 years, and I hope that they come back.
And they've been eerily silent in the last 17 or 18 days since election as well. And I think that's partly due to their all eyes on the two runoff races in Georgia.
Yeah, although the interesting thing is the extent to which you see now Chris Christie and others coming out and saying that, Trump is doing real damage to the country. Trump is doing real damage to the party, because, in fact, the risk they now have is that, moderate Republicans in Georgia won't vote for them because of the way the president is behaving. So, these are all it is interesting to watch, and perhaps it gives us some hope that a return to a recognition that the Union is more important than any one person or partisan position. Hopefully that returns to be a shared idea, because there's so many challenges, and COVID is just one of them over there in America. And it's going to require some collectivism that has been sadly missing.
Ohio, your home state, that's historically working class and has voted Democratic over a number of years, but has now voted for Trump twice. What's your take on what's going on in the Buckeye State? Why is it turning
Well,
red?
the thing to understand about Ohio is, in fact, it has voted with the U.S. president in every election since 1896, except 2 times. And those 2 times, one is when there was an Ohioan as VP on a ticket against FDR, and FDR only narrowly lost Ohio then. And the other time was John F. Kennedy, because that's the one election where the country split along sectarian lines rather than partisan politics, and so there were just simply more Protestants than Catholics in Ohio at that point. But Ohio has been the bellwether state. It is the Edom and Arrow of America, and a bit like Edom and Arrow, though, it is no longer the bellwether. And I thought the last election, they might, when people expected that Hillary would win, I thought Ohio was going to go for Trump and break that bellwether status, and it's done it this time. And I suspect that is because Ohio, which used to be a perfect microcosm of the United States in terms of gender, age, ethnic background, city, country, etc. Ohio is really about 4 or 5 little states within one state. Ohio is now becoming older, whiter, and although I would guess, I don't know the figures on this, probably less university educated than it used to be. And that is simply because the jobs are in the South and the West of the United States. So people are leaving Ohio. My family is a great example of that. My family's been in Toledo for now 5 generations. I'm the 5th generation, and there are none of us left in Ohio in my generation. All of my cousins and I, we've all left, and mainly to go south and west, and in my case, very far south. So I suspect that's what's having an impact on how Ohio is voting these days.
I asked you earlier about the moments that shaped the foundations of your politics. I want to ask the same question, but in respect to your faith.
Yeah, so there's a very clear moment that shaped my faith, and that is I grew up a Catholic, and I'm still a Catholic, and went to Catholic school, Catholic high school, Catholic university. When I was 8 years old, and the parish priest, who was a family friend, came to our year 3 class and was looking for boys to volunteer to be altar servers. And I thought, well, hang on, I could do that. And, I called the Catholic bishop on a talkback radio program and asked him why girls couldn't be altar servers. And I don't think he was very happy. He gave a kind of flustered answer, which was something along the lines of, that altar serving was like the first step to priesthood, which it's not. And priests were men because Jesus was a man, and I thought, well, that's totally unsatisfactory. So I kind of started a career as a Catholic feminist at age 8 based on that phone call. And as my dad used to say to me, could you pick a harder fight?
Yeah, right.
And he's right. I'm about 43 years on from that, and we have girl altar servers now. Girls can be altar servers, so slow progress. Still don't have female priests yet.
Well, and we'll talk about that in a moment. I wasn't going to ask this question just because I think you've probably been asked this question 10,000 times, but I'm assuming that the listeners that are not members of the One Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church would ask this question of you: how can you reconcile being a feminist and also a practicing Catholic? So
I have a degree in feminist theology, and
good start.
And I have this line, which is flippant and meant to get attention, but I think it's also true, which makes it quite useful, which is that Jesus did not share the same fear of people with vaginas that the Vatican apparently does. And, that is true. Jesus, after the resurrection, appeared to 2 women first. Jesus, elevated his mother and revered his mother in such a significant way, and performed his first miracle at her request. In the Old Testament, there is in the book of wisdom, where wisdom, or Sophia, is depicted as God in female terms. And there are just multiple ways. You can, if you start to read the Bible with a feminist lens, from the lens of women's experience, you start to realize that the way we've interpreted the scriptures for 2,000 years now has been men interpreting it and telling us what men think it should mean. So you go to the story of Moses, who saved God's people from slavery. Moses only got to survive because 5 women acted to ensure that at his birth he was able to survive and not be killed, as all male babies were ordered to do by the Pharaoh. So they're just, if you start to mine scripture and tradition, you start to read it from a lens of women's experience, you realize that when we say that God is neither male nor female, when we say that, you know, God reflects the full range of humanity, that is true. That is true. It is the institution of the church. It is the all-male institution which preserves power to itself. That is, in my view, where we fall down. And I think the institution of the church, I think the church itself would be strengthened if the church made use of all of its members' talents and abilities, because they're all given to us by God and we're all made in God's image.
The divide that's existing in the church at the moment, I guess it's been going on for quite some time, but between progressive Catholicism and sort of living the teachings of social justice versus traditional Catholicism, the sort of dogmatic application of texts and traditions that you just spoken about. Then, when I read your stuff on the church in publications, I find your words to be a beacon of hope for us progressive Catholics. But then I see what actually is playing out from the Vatican and beyond, and it depresses me greatly. And I feel like the walls are closing in. Do you still have hope about where the church is heading?
Well, we Christians always have hope. Sure. But, and thank you for your kind words, by the way. That very generous. I suppose I look at someone like Pope Francis, who in many ways has said and done things that advance the notion of the primacy of conscience. So he says we're not here to form consciences. We're here to guide them. And so the idea that he has talked about this, and as a Catholic in good conscience, your decision about, for example, birth control is your decision. It's not for you to do, to use or not use birth control because the church says you shouldn't. It's a decision you need to make in your conscience. And so he's done lots. He's elevated teachings like conscience. He has talked about not being judgmental. He has talked about welcoming, and recognizing, families who have same-sex parents. He's said and done lots of things that are encouraging, but I think they're gestures in the end, because he hasn't changed one actual church teaching. And unless he changes the institutional rules and the institutional practices, it's nice that he says all these things, but when he dies or resigns, because apparently now popes can resign, he will it can revert right back, and all his emphasis can disappear, and that's the real problem I fear right now, is that we have a church where these kind of good things, this progress, if I would call it that, is really dependent on the goodwill of just one man. And when he goes, there'll be a new pope, and the new pope may be very different. And, one of my theology professors used to say, there's nothing deader than a dead pope. And, meaning once a pope is gone, the new pope takes up a whole new emphasis and focus. So, yeah, I have hope, but, the church is such a slow moving beast. And my hope at one point was that the church would change because it would need to, out of necessity, that, you wouldn't have enough priests, to celebrate the sacraments. And therefore you would need to start to think about things like married men and women being ordained priests. That has, my frustration is, is here in Australia and in other first world countries, the Catholic Church has instead responded by taking men out of the third world who've been ordained and sending them to first world countries. And I think that's a real injustice. It's an injustice to those third world countries, that we've taken some of the most educated people out of their communities and sent them to service some very, well-off first world communities, when, there are people, former priests, who are now married men, women with theology degrees, people who could serve in those roles in those first world countries. And I'm incredibly frustrated when I think the talent that we are losing and wasting, and the talent we are taking for ourselves, that really should be shared more equitably with the world.
Let's flip to another religion, and that's the Australian Labor Party. When you finally moved across to Australia and started to carve out a pathway in the Labor Party itself, I'm interested in getting a sense about some of the cultural challenges and experiences that you faced as an American trying to make your way in ALP politics.
Oh, there weren't that many, truth be told. I think I had, been involved in student politics. I had worked as an intern for the Democratic governor of Ohio. I was hardly a neophyte at politics, and in many ways there were a lot of similarities. I arrived right in the middle of in 94, right up into the lead up of the 95 New South Wales state election, which is the one where Bob Carr won and took government off the Libs. And, I think that was a great time to arrive. I lived in a marginal seat, John Watkins in Gladesville. My husband was the SEC secretary, so we were just straight into it, letterboxing, mail, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that the funniest thing that happened, though, in that campaign was that I was working in the campaign office and answering the phones, and the Bob Carr's then communications director called the office. He needed to check on something, and I answered the phone, and the communications director, one Mr. Walt Secord, who's now a member of the upper house in New South Wales, he spoke to me for a few minutes, and then he asked to be put straight through the campaign director, and he said, "Get that woman with the American accent off the telephone."
That's harsh.
Now, well, if you know Walt, he's Canadian, so hardly had room to speak. But what was even more harsh is that about a good 15 years later, I became premier, and Walt became my chief of staff.
Lovely. I like it.
So he went around telling everyone how desperately wrong he was.
That's good.
in 94 to order me off the telephone.
That's fantastic. Let's turn to contemporary politics with what time we have left. And if we have time, we can come back to the basketball. The handling of COVID by the federal government. I just want to get your take on that. I think the original assessment would have been at the time, in the middle of the pandemic, that there was a sense of national unity across the political spectrum. But as time moves on and things start to move into, I guess, what we call a COVID normal, my feel is that the state premier's kind of dragged Morrison and his government kicking and screaming to provide a proper health response to this crisis. And if that had not been the case, then we may be like Britain or the United States. What's your take on that?
So I sit on the Senate Select Committee on COVID, and we oversight the government's response to COVID. And, a few things I'll make observations about here. The federal government took some good decisions, such as the closure of the international borders. Although that being said, they took them in a rather haphazard way at the beginning. It's still not, and didn't respond quickly enough to countries that pose significant threats like the United States until later. It's still not clear to the COVID committee, even the government's refused to say when cabinet was first briefed and when these decisions were taken. And so the border closure, the failure with the Ruby Princess, and the failures at our borders had early on certainly made that first lockdown necessary. And while it was a good decision to shut the borders in March, it probably could have been done earlier, and we probably could have had far more effective control at the borders. Moving through the crisis, the haphazard way in which the first lockdown was implemented, are schools safe? Are they not safe? What are the rules? Why can you have 10 people at a funeral and only 5 people at a wedding? Like, it was all a bit, in hindsight, a bit haphazard. And, I do think the country owes an enormous debt of gratitude to Dan Andrews and Gladys Berejiklian, who decided between themselves, enough of this, we're going to get some clarity about this, and we are just going to take decisions as the 2 most populous states. And that, I think, saved Australia from a far worse first wave outbreak. And then you move into, yes, there were problems with the hotel quarantine in Victoria, leading to that second wave. But frankly, I also I think that along with the aged care outbreak has shown, unfortunately, Scott Morrison to be the kind of guy who frankly wants to shove blame onto the states. Quarantine is a federal responsibility. Why he outsourced that to the state, except for the fact that he didn't want to be responsible for if something went wrong. And the failure of the national cabinet that Scott Morrison set up to deliver on a range of matters. So while I think Australia has been incredibly fortunate, I think that has been due partly to the closure of the international borders, partly to the response of the states and the leadership of the states, including Tasmania, Queensland, WA, South Australia. They all took decisions about border closures and lockdowns that made a real difference and kept COVID limited in its spread. It's hard not to escape a view that Scott Morrison came to every decision late. He came to it reluctantly, and really was forced to it, whether it was JobKeeper, whether it was lockdowns, whether it was responding to aged care. He really had to be forced into decisions at the last moment. And so I think we're very lucky to have had the states and their Labor and Liberal and their leadership. The last thing I'll say is that, while I'm grateful we haven't had the widespread COVID, and I put that also down to the willingness of the Australian people to take the necessary measures to stop the spread of COVID. The app, the COVID Safe app, has been just a multi-million-dollar failure. The Opal card here in New South Wales has detected more cases of contacts of COVID than the Opal Safe app, whatever, COVID Safe app. Sorry. I don't want to go as far as saying, despite the Commonwealth, we've succeeded, but I think the Commonwealth, while it's had moments, really has to recognize that the states and the Australian people themselves have take a great deal of credit for limiting the spread of COVID in this country. And lastly, you remember Scott Morrison was back and forth. Do we have an elimination strategy or suppression strategy? And he refused to actually nail his colors to the mast. And, in hindsight, where we are now, we are essentially at elimination. And why we didn't just start out with that. We have the capacity to close our borders as an island nation. Why we did not just start out with the view that we were going to seek an elimination strategy early, do the hard lockdown, get it eliminated, and then live the life that most of us are living now here in New South Wales and soon, hopefully across the country, where we have such capacity to live in a way that countries in the US and the UK and around Europe do not. And that's, I think, longer term, that's going to be of greater benefit, economic benefit and psychological benefit to our population if we are able to live without COVID ravaging through our communities.
You've been incredibly vocal on social media and all other various sort of media platforms about these Australians that are residents and citizens that are currently stranded overseas and their inability to come home. I've not been able to find out an answer as to why the government won't bring these people home. Where are we? Can you give us an update on this? Where are we up to this?
Well, we started about a month or two ago with some 26,000 Australians stranded. We're now up to 36,000 Australians stranded. And these are people who can't come home because the borders are closed, because there is a cap on international arrivals every day, and there's individual caps in cities, and there are limits in quarantine capacity. And so the Commonwealth Government, who are responsible for Australians being able to cross the border, and it should be a right of citizenship to be able to cross the border into Australia, have been keeping people excluded from Australia. And some of these situations are heartbreaking. I mean, there are families who are stranded. There are people being sent to homeless shelters. There are people who are now facing the northern hemisphere winter. And it's not as if these people haven't been trying to come home since March. Most of them have. And I can't understand, frankly, why the Commonwealth haven't done what they did early on in this crisis. You remember early on, they brought people home from Wuhan. They had them set up in a federally run quarantine facility. They did it before. They could do it again. And they now have in front of them a report from their own handpicked expert, Jane Halton, who has recommended that the Commonwealth government run a surge capacity, federally managed quarantine facility, put an exclusion zone around it, she says, create the capacity to get these people home. It's, some 4,000 of them are vulnerable. That means they are financially or physically, medically vulnerable. And so all I can imagine is that Scott Morrison doesn't want to be responsible. Like, this is a man who has shoved quarantine onto the states. He tried to shove aged care onto the states, even though at the beginning they said it would be a federal government responsibility. And it's a failure of his leadership. I find it hard to believe that even Tony Abbott or John Howard or Malcolm Turnbull would have left 36,000 of our fellow citizens languishing and stranded overseas during a global pandemic. I mean, even Donald Trump sent out planes from the United States to bring their citizens home. And, I think that's a really sad indictment that our federal government, the Morrison government, has been behind the Trump administration in securing the safety and the return of its citizens.
Last couple of questions before we wrap up, just changing the tune a bit. We've seen on our TV screens in the past 4 or 5 years the rise of neo-Nazis and right-wing extremists in the United States attacking and killing innocent civilians, and we sort of assume that this is just an American problem, but that is not actually the case. And there's been reports recently from ASIO about the rise of right-wing extremism here in Australia, and then this is where I insert a Sky After Dark joke, but I haven't written one there. What's Labor's response to this? Because I don't imagine we're going to get too much from the Tories on this stuff.
So you're right. This is not just an American phenomenon, but it is one of those examples of how things that are happening in America spread globally. And that is the rise of right-wing extremism in Europe and in the United States is also happening here in Australia. And that's partly because these groups and individuals can connect online so easily. And so, of course, people do remember that the Christchurch shooter, Brenton Tarrant, is an Australian. And we've never had a proper conversation to the extent to which he was radicalized here or how he was radicalized. But we know that, Brenton Tarrant cited Anders Breivik, the Oslo shooter, in his manifesto. The recent shootings in the United States, in Charleston and in El Paso, they cited Brenton Tarrant in their manifestos. Like, this is a connected community where they inspire and influence one another globally. There are groups in every other Five Eyes country besides Australia that are right-wing extremist groups listed as terrorist organizations. Australia has not listed one. And that's despite the fact some of these groups that are listed internationally have chapters here in Australia. Labor has been for some time taking heed of the national security agencies like ASIO and their warnings. Mike Burgess, the director of ASIO, has made clear publicly that right-wing extremism now accounts for between 30 and 40% of ASIO's counterterrorism work. And he says that an attack in Australia is possible. And we need to take that seriously as a parliament and as a country. And Labor has been making clear for some time that we would support the government in a review of our terrorist prescription laws to see if they're fit for purpose for right-wing extremist organizations, our countering violent extremism and preventing radicalization programs, which are all aimed around Islamic extremism. Are they fit for purpose for right-wing extremism? What are we doing to assist online companies to removing hate speech and hate symbols. And where is our anti-racism strategy? We haven't had one since the Gillard government launched one in 2012. And so, valuing the multicultural nature of our community and the strength that it brings to Australia, these are all key things that we could and should be doing in the face of this terrorist threat. And, your listeners in Melbourne will have seen the news, as many would have around the country last week, that a right-wing extremist was jailed last week for 12 years for his plot to, quote, blow up Muslims and lefties. And so, and he's not the only one in the last year or two who's been arrested, charged, and his has been the most recent conviction. So this is a real problem for us. It is also a byproduct of the both COVID, which made radicalization and propaganda online far easier, and the economic disruption that it brought, and the willingness to blame minorities by some, and some people in positions of leadership as well in Australia and around the world, who have made either overt or covert kind of suggestions about where the virus came from. We need clear leadership. That's the other thing we need. We need our federal leaders on all sides to stand up and condemn this. The UK has made an unequivocal condemnation of right-wing extremism and a rejection of it. And, those are the types of conversations we should be having here in Australia.
Last question. In my research, I didn't realize that you're a co-founder of Lean. And a couple of weeks ago, that's actually not true. And because of COVID lockdown, I haven't lost track of time. At some point in 2020, Felicity Wade, the co-convener of Lean, came on to talk about the work that Lean is doing, particularly in the Hunter region when it comes to climate policy. Obviously, there's been a lot of reports over the last 2 or 3 months about the Labor Party's position on climate. And I just wanted to finish up. Last question to you would be, what needs to happen in order for the caucus and, broadly speaking, the party to get some consensus around climate policy heading into the next federal election?
Well, let me just say that there is actually a heck of a lot of consensus. And, we've got a position of net zero emissions by 2050, a position that's been endorsed by the shadow cabinet and by the caucus, and there is no one in any serious attempt to overturn that. There is a clear recognition throughout the caucus and the party that we are, yes, we are transitioning to a carbon constrained world, and that will have a significant impact on how we source our electricity. But that also provides a significant opportunity for jobs, for lower power prices, and for Australia to make use of its amazing resources as the sunniest and windiest country on the planet. So there is a heck of a lot of consensus across this. And, while I understand, I think, what you're referring to in your question, the commentary of my colleague, the member for Hunter, Joel Fitzgibbon. And I have a lot of time for Joel, and I think that I have a lot of fondness for him. And I think the concern he puts about ensuring that workers in coal mining and gas understand our support for them, that's a valid argument to make. But honestly, can I just say that, Joel is the only one out there talking about a divide in the Labor Party, and there isn't. And the reality is, if Joel felt that there was such a strong base of support for the point of view, I don't think he would have resigned from the shadow cabinet. Now, I think Joel was always going to resign from the shadow cabinet, by the way. I don't think that this was a massive walkout on a point of policy differences, in as much as he was always planning to go at this point, which is what he told the caucus when he did resign. So I think that the reality is we now have a world where you've got a Biden presidency, you've got every state and territory, Liberal and Labor, signed up to net zero emissions by 2050. You have the Business Council of Australia signed up to it. You have major corporations in Australia signed up to it. The only people not signed up to it and who can't say the words is Scott Morrison and his cabinet team. And there's plenty of division on their side on this point. I don't think you get a few of their disparate group MPs in a room, and they'd have a very different views about. You've still got Matt Canavan out there campaigning for a new coal-fired power station. So look, I'm hopeful that with the election of a Biden presidency, and with some sense returning to the world on these questions of confronting climate change and restraining carbon emissions, that Australia could perhaps once and for all put the climate wars behind us and do the right thing for our country, for our children, and for our planet.
Wouldn't that be wonderful? Senator Kristina Keneally, thank you so much for coming on the show today and sharing with us certainly some great stories from your journey from Ohio to Sydney, and we wish you the best of luck heading into what most likely will be an election year next year.
Oh, thank you very much, Stephen, and thank you to your listeners.